The late-night swimmer, I never thought much about lake houses. My wife, Sarah, had always dreamed of owning one, though, so when we finally found a place by the water, we jumped at the chance. It wasn't anything fancy, just a small cabin with a great view, surrounded by trees. We bought it as a weekend getaway, a place to disconnect from everything and recharge. The first weekend we spent there was perfect. The weather was great, and we spent most of our time lounging on the deck, soaking in the quiet. Our dog, Rusty, loved running around the yard, sniffing everything in sight. I was finally starting to relax, feeling like we had made the right choice. But then, something happened. The first night, I woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of water splashing. I wasn't really sure what time it was, maybe 3 a.m.? The moonlight was spilling in through the window, and I could see Sarah sleeping soundly next to me. I rolled over, squinting out the window towards the lake. It was hard to see much in the dark, but there was definitely something moving out there. At first, I thought it was just a neighbor out for a midnight swim. There were a few houses on the other side of the lake, but something about it fell off. I shrugged it off, though, and went back to sleep. No big deal, right? The next night, it happened again. This time, though, I woke up to the sound of something splashing closer to the house. I sat up in bed, blinking in the dark, trying to shake off the fog of sleep. Sarah stirred a bit, mumbling something, but she stayed asleep. I walked over to the window and peered out. The figure, whatever it was much nearer now, right near the edge of the water. It looked like a person swimming, but there was something strange about the way they moved, almost too smooth, like they were gliding instead of swimming. My heart started to beat a little faster, and I couldn't quite explain why. I reached for the light switch and turned on the porch light. The moment that beam of light hit the water, the figure disappeared below the surface, vanishing in an instant like it had never been there. My chest tightened. I shook my head, trying to tell myself it was just some late-night swimmer, but something inside me knew it wasn't that simple. The next day, I mentioned it to Sarah over breakfast. She just shrugged it off. "Maybe it's just someone out there," she said, sipping her coffee. "It's a lake after all. People swim at all hours." She seemed pretty unconcerned, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. That night, Rusty was acting weird. He wouldn't settle down. He paced the deck, barking occasionally, and every time he looked toward the lake, he growled low in his throat. I tried to reassure him, but it was like he knew something I didn't. I figured I'd just keep an eye out, but I didn't want to worry Sarah, so I didn't bring it up again. The next few days were strange, to say the least. Nothing major happened, but little things started to creep me out. The first time it really hit me was when I went outside in the morning to grab the paper. I noticed something odd by the edge of the deck, wet footprints. They weren't just any wet footprints, though. They were large, and they led from the edge of the lake, up the small hill to our deck. It was as if someone had walked up out of the water, leaving their prints behind. The odd thing? We hadn't seen anyone come or go from the lake. There wasn't a soul around, just the trees and water. I called Sarah outside to look, and her face went pale. We didn't have an explanation. Our dog, Rusty, was still acting up, growling every time he went near the water. It was like he knew the lake held something that wasn't supposed to be there. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching us. That'd be why the end of the week, the tension was unbearable. That night, Sarah and I were on the deck, sitting in the dark with just the soft hum of the night around us. The air was thick with humidity, and the crickets were going crazy, but every now and then, there was this strange silence that fell over everything. And then the growl. Rusty was at the edge of the deck, hackles raised, teeth bared, staring at the lake. We both froze, looking at him, then following his gaze to the water. It was then that I saw it again. The figure, but this time it was closer than ever. I could see the outline of a person's head bobbing just above the surface, barely visible in the moonlight. My stomach dropped. I grabbed Sarah's arm, and we stood there, both of us unable to look away, too terrified to move. Then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the figure disappeared again, sinking beneath the water. There was no splash, no sound. It was just gone. The next morning, I went down to the lake, hoping to find something that would explain what was going on. Maybe I could find some evidence, footprints, broken branches, anything to make sense of it. As I approached the water, I felt a cold chill creep up my spine, even though it was a warm day. The lake was calm, unnervingly still. I couldn't help but glance back toward the cabin, half expecting to see someone standing at the window, watching me. I knelt down to the water's edge, running my fingers through the wet sand, looking for something, anything. That's when I noticed it. There was something at the bottom of the lake, just beneath the surface, barely visible. It was too dark to make out clearly, but there was something off about it. I stood up quickly, my heart racing. I backed away from the water, but just as I turned to head back to the house, I saw a flash of movement out of the corner of my eye. It was gone in a split second, but it was enough to make my pulse race. I didn't know what I'd seen, but I knew I couldn't ignore it anymore. When I got back to the cabin, I found Sarah sitting at the kitchen table, reading through some old brochures. I didn't want to freak her out, but I could tell something was wrong by the way she was looking at me. Her face was pale, and her hand was shaking slightly as she turned the pages. I walked over and sat down next to her. "What's going on?" I asked quietly. She hesitated for a moment, then said, "I did some digging. I found something." She handed me a folded-up newspaper clipping, and I opened it slowly. It was a story from years ago about a local teenager who had drowned in the lake. The article mentioned that the body had never been found, and there were rumors that the boy's ghost still swam the waters at night. My stomach twisted as I read. The ghost of a drowning victim? I couldn't believe it, but suddenly, everything started to make sense. The wet footprints, the figure in the lake, Rusty's constant growling. All of it pointed to one thing. There was something in that lake, something that wasn't supposed to be there. That night, we decided to stay inside. I didn't want to go anywhere near the lake, and I think Sarah felt the same. We kept all the lights on, even though we both knew it wouldn't help. We locked the doors and sat in the living room, trying to distract ourselves with TV, but it was hard to focus on anything. The atmosphere in the house felt heavy, like we were waiting for something to happen. Every time the wind rustled the trees outside, Rusty would jump up, barking furiously, his eyes locked on the dark lake. At one point, I thought I saw a shadow move in the corner of my eye, but when I looked, nothing was there. The tension was unbearable. It was like the whole house was holding its breath, waiting. We stayed like that for hours, the silence of the night pressing in on us. Then, just after midnight, it happened. We were sitting on the couch, both of us tense, when we heard it, a faint splashing sound coming from the lake. At first, I thought it was just the wind or some animal, but it was too regular, too deliberate. My heart started racing. I stood up, my hand instinctively reaching for the porch light switch. As I flicked it on, I heard a low, guttural growl from Rusty. He was standing at the window, staring out into the darkness. We both rushed to the door, and I cracked it open just enough to peer outside. That's when I saw it. There, just at the water's edge, the figure. It was unmistakable this time, and it was no longer just a vague shape in the distance. It was a person floating just above the surface, their limbs stiff and unnatural. I could see the pale outline of a face, but it wasn't the face of a living person. It was wrong, hollowed, sunken like a face that had been underwater for too long. My breath caught in my throat. I don't even know how long we stood there, frozen, staring out into the night. My whole body was shaking, and I could feel my pulse thundering in my ears. The figure didn't move, didn't even blink, it seemed. It just hung there like some kind of grotesque apparition, staring back at us. I couldn't tear my eyes away. Sarah was holding onto my arm so tight, I could feel her nails digging into my skin. Rusty was still growling, but it wasn't the usual protective bark. It was almost like he was afraid. I've never seen him like that. Then, without warning, the figure started to move. Slowly at first, as if it was testing the water. The way it glided through the lake was unnatural, no splashing, no effort, just smooth like it was part of the water itself. I knew in that moment that it wasn't a living person, but something else entirely. Something that had no business being here. Without thinking, I grabbed Sarah's hand and pulled her back into the house, slamming the door behind us. I locked it, then backed away from the windows, trying to catch my breath. My heart was still pounding in my chest. I couldn't speak. There were no words for what we had just seen. We sat in the living room, huddled together, our dog trembling at our feet. We didn't say a word to each other. What could we say? We knew we couldn't stay there any longer. I was sure now that someone was in that lake, something that shouldn't be. We didn't know what it wanted, but it was clear it wasn't just some local myth. The stories, the rumors, they were real. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized that maybe we weren't the first to feel the presence of whatever that thing was. Maybe we had just become the next targets of something that had been waiting for a long time that we packed up the next morning. I don't think either of us slept that night. There was no conversation about it. We just started putting things in the car, trying to get away as quickly as possible. The lake house that had seemed like such a perfect escape, a peaceful retreat, now felt like a prison. I didn't even want to look at the water one last time, afraid I might see that figure again, waiting for us. When I started the car, I didn't feel the usual relief of heading home. Instead, it was more like escaping a nightmare that I wasn't sure was over. Rusty was still acting strange, staring out the rearview mirror, his eyes wide, his body tense. I had the feeling he knew something we didn't. Months later, we learned something chilling from a local. The ghost story about the drowned teenager, that was only part of it. Apparently, people in the area had seen the figure in the lake for years, but no one talked about it much anymore. It wasn't just the ghost of one boy, but the spirit of anyone who had ever drowned there. The lake, they said, had a way of pulling people in, not just to drown, but to stay. I don't know if I believe in ghosts, or if it was just the fear of the unknown that got to us, but I do know one thing. We never went back. The lake house is still there, empty and quiet, but the memories of that place still haunt me. Every time I close my eyes, I see that pale, sunken face floating in the water, watching. The missing kayak, it was supposed to be the perfect weekend getaway. Me and 4 of my closest friends had rented this secluded lake house about 2 hours from the city. The place was gorgeous, right on the water, surrounded by dense woods, and totally private. We arrived Friday evening, unpacked, and immediately tied our kayaks to the dock. The sun was setting, and the lake looked like glass. We laughed, cracked open some beers, and just enjoyed being away from everything. That first night felt like a dream. But by the next morning, things started to feel off that I was the first one up, and I noticed it right away. One of the kayaks was missing. It was the red one, the one I'd used the day before. I remember double-checking the knots when we tied them up, so it didn't make sense. I woke everyone up, and we all figured it must have come loose and drifted off. We even joked about it, saying the lake had claimed its first victim. But deep down, I felt uneasy. The dock was calm, no waves, no wind. How could it have just floated away? We decided not to let it ruin the weekend and spent the day hiking and grilling by the water. But that night, things got weirder. Around midnight, we were all sitting around the fire pit, telling stupid stories and roasting marshmallows when we heard a loud splash coming from the direction of the dock. We froze. The sound was too big to be a fish or a bird. My friend Jake grabbed a flashlight and pointed it toward the water. There it was, the missing red kayak, drifting about 20 feet from the dock, completely empty. No paddle, no person, just there. We all stared at it, not saying a word. The water was dead calm, no waves, no wind, just like the night before. How the hell had it gotten there? Jake tried to brush it off, saying it must have been caught on something underwater, and finally broke free, but his voice was shaky. None of us bought it. That we decided to pull the kayak back to the dock and tie it up again, this time with extra knots. But as we were doing that, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The woods around the house were pitch black, and the flashlight only reached so far. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone or something standing there. When we got back to the fire, no one was in the mood to keep joking around. We put out the fire and went inside, locking the doors behind us. That's when I noticed the fridge door was slightly open. I could have sworn we closed it after dinner. Inside, a pack of hot dogs and a few beers were missing. We all just stood there, staring at each other, too freaked out to say what we were all thinking. Someone was out there. The next morning, we tried to act normal, but the mood was heavy. Over breakfast, my friend Sarah mentioned she'd heard footsteps on the deck around 3 a.m. She thought it was one of us getting a glass of water, but when she checked, no one was there. Then Jake chimed in, saying he'd seen something moving in the trees while we were grilling the day before. He'd brushed it off as a deer, but now he wasn't so sure. I didn't want to admit it, but I'd felt it too. This constant, nagging feeling that we weren't alone. We decided to stick together and do a quick sweep of the property, just to ease our minds. That's when we found the boathouse. The boathouse was this old, rickety structure tucked into the trees at the edge of the property. We hadn't paid much attention to it when we arrived, but now it felt wrong. The door was slightly ajar, and when we pushed it open, the smell hit us first. Damp wood, mildew, and something else, something sour. Inside, there was a makeshift bed of old blankets, empty food wrappers, and a pile of beer cans. My stomach dropped. Someone had been living here, maybe still was. We found the missing hot dogs and beers stashed in a corner, along with a few other things we hadn't even realized were gone. A flashlight, a lighter, and one of Sarah's sweatshirts. The air felt heavy, like the walls were closing in, and I couldn't shake the feeling that whoever had been here was still watching us. We bolted out of the boathouse and back to the main house, locking every door and window behind us. No one wanted to say it out loud, but we were all thinking the same thing. This wasn't just some random drifter passing through. Whoever was out there had been watching us, maybe even since we arrived. Sarah suggested we call the police, But Jake argued that it would take them forever to get out here. And what would we even say? Hey, someone stole our hot dogs and borrowed a kayak. It sounded ridiculous, but the fear was real. We decided to stay together and keep an eye on each other until we could leave the next morning. That night, we barricaded ourselves in the living room, pushing the couch against the door and keeping all the lights on. We tried to distract ourselves with card games and bad TV, but every little noise made us jump. The creak of the house settling, the rustle of leaves outside, even the hum of the fridge. Around 2 a.m., we heard it again, footsteps on the deck. This time, they were slow and deliberate, like someone was pacing back and forth. Jake grabbed a kitchen knife, and I picked up the fireplace poker, but none of us had the courage to actually go outside and confront whoever, or whatever, was out there. We just sat there, frozen, listening to the footsteps until they finally stopped. The silence that followed was almost worse. The next morning, we packed up as fast as we could, barely speaking to each other. The boathouse was empty when we checked it one last time, but the blankets and trash were still there, a grim reminder that whatever had happened wasn't just in our heads. As we loaded the cars, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. I kept glancing at the tree line, half expecting to see a face staring back at me. But there was nothing, just the woods, silent and still. We left the missing kayak tied to the dock. None of us wanted to touch it. We reported everything to the property manager when we got back, but they didn't seem surprised. They said the lake house had been vacant for months before we rented it, and they'd had issues with trespassers in the past. They promised to check the boathouse and change the locks, but I could tell they weren't taking it seriously. To this day, I don't know who was out there with us that weekend. I don't know why they took the kayak, why they lit the fire pit, or why they watched us from the trees. What I do know is that I'll never forget the feeling of being hunted in my own home, if only for a weekend. Sometimes late at night, I still hear those footsteps on the deck, slow and deliberate, and I wonder if they ever really stopped. The Watcher by the lake, it was supposed to be the perfect summer getaway. My family and I have been coming to the lake house for years, and it always felt like a safe haven, quiet, peaceful, and completely ours. The days were filled with lazy afternoons by the water, the kids splashing around, and the kind of calm that only nature can bring. But that all changed one evening, just as the sun was dipping below the trees. I was inside making dinner when my husband, Mark, called me to the window. "There's someone on the dock," he said, his voice low but steady. I followed his gaze and saw him, a man sitting at the very edge of our dock, fishing like he owned the place. My stomach dropped. We weren't expecting anyone, and the nearest neighbors were miles away. Mark went out to confront him while I stayed inside with the kids, watching from the window. The man looked up as Mark approached, and even from a distance, I could see him smile, a casual, unbothered smile, like he hadn't just trespassed on a private property. Mark said something, and the man stood up, nodding apologetically. He packed up his fishing gear quickly, muttering something about not realizing the property was private. He left without a fuss, but something about the way he lingered, glancing back at the house as he walked away, made my skin crawl. I told myself I was overreacting. Maybe he was just a tourist who got lost. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The next few days were unsettling. It started with small things. I glance out the kitchen window and see movement near the tree line. Just a shadow, really, but enough to make me second-guess myself. Then one afternoon, I was outside with the kids when I noticed him again. This time, he wasn't on the dock. He was standing at the edge of the woods, just watching us. My heart raced, but I tried to stay calm for the kids. I waved, thinking maybe he'd wave back, and it would all feel normal again. He didn't. He just stood there, completely still, like he was waiting for something. I hurried the kids inside and locked the doors, telling myself I was being paranoid. But later that night, I heard footsteps on the porch. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. Mark grabbed a flashlight and went to check, but there was no one there, just a set of muddy footprints under the living room window. By then, the unease had settled into a constant knot in my stomach. We started locking every door and window, even during the day. The kids picked up on the tension, asking why we couldn't go outside as much. I didn't know how to explain it to them without scaring them, so I just made excuses. But the man kept showing up, sometimes on the dock, sometimes near the woods, always just far enough away that we couldn't confront him directly. It felt like he was testing us, seeing how much we'd tolerate. One night, after finding more footprints under the windows, we finally called the police. They came out, took our statement, and promised to patrol the area. But when they left, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were still being watched. The police didn't find anything that night, but they told us to call again if we saw him. For a couple of days, things were quiet, almost too quiet. I kept expecting to see him, but the dock in the woods stayed empty. I started to relax a little, thinking maybe he'd moved on. But then one morning I went outside to get the mail and noticed something in the grass near the edge of the property. It was a fishing lure, one of those shiny, colorful ones. I hadn't seen it there before, and it definitely wasn't ours. My stomach turned as I picked it up, the metal cold in my hand. It felt like a message, like he was reminding us he was still around. I showed it to Mark, and we both agreed it was time to take things more seriously. We installed motion sensor lights around the house and started keeping a bat by the door, just in case. The breaking point came a few nights later. I was up late, unable to sleep, when I heard the motion sensor lights click on. My heart jumped into my throat as I crept to the window. At first, I didn't see anything, just a bright light flooding the yard. But then I noticed movement near the tree line. He was there again, standing just outside the circle of light, staring at the house. This time, he wasn't trying to hide. He just stood there, watching like he wanted us to know he was there. I woke Mark up, and we called the police immediately. This time, they took us seriously. They searched the area and found an abandoned cabin about half a mile into the woods. Inside, they found evidence that someone had been living there. Empty food wrappers, a sleeping bag, and, most chillingly, a notebook filled with notes about our family. Our routines, our habits, even the kids' names. He'd been watching us for weeks. The police told us they'd increase patrols and promised to keep an eye out for the man, but they couldn't do much more without catching him in the act. We spent the next few days on edge, jumping at every sound, every shadow. The kids could tell something was wrong, but we tried to keep things as normal as possible for them. We didn't let them play outside alone, and we kept the curtains drawn most of the time. It felt like we were living in a cage, prisoners in our own home. I kept replaying the image of him standing at the edge of the woods, staring at us. What did he want? Why us? The questions gnawed at me, but there were no answers. Then, one night, it all came to a head. I was in the kitchen, washing dishes, when I heard a noise outside. A soft thud, like someone had bumped into the porch railing. My hands froze, the water still running in the sink. I turned it off and listened, my heart pounding so loud I was sure whoever was outside could hear it. The motion sensor lights hadn't come on, which made it even worse. I grabbed my phone and called Mark, who was upstairs putting the kids to bed. He came down quietly, the bat in his hand, and we both stood there listening. That's when we heard it, a faint scratching sound like someone was trying to open a window. Mark motioned for me to stay back as he crept toward the living room. I followed anyway, too scared to be alone. When we got to the window, we saw him. He was right there, his face pressed against the glass, staring straight at us. I don't think I'll ever forget the look on his face. His eyes were wide, almost wild, and his mouth was twisted into this unsettling half-smile, like he was enjoying the fear he was causing. Mark shouted at him to get away from the house, and for a moment, he just stood there, frozen. Then, slowly, he stepped back, still staring at us, before turning and disappearing into the darkness. Mark ran outside to chase him, but by the time he got out there, the man was gone. We called the police again, and this time, they brought dogs to track him. They found his trail leading back to the abandoned cabin, but he was gone. All that was left was more evidence of his obsession. Photos of our family, some of them taken through our windows, and more notes detailing our daily routines. It was like he'd been studying us, learning everything he could. After that night, we decided to cut our summer short and leave the lake house. We couldn't stay there anymore, not with the constant fear that he might come back. The police assured us they'd keep looking for him, but they never found him. To this day, I don't know who he was or what he wanted. We never saw him again, but the experience left a mark on all of us. The kids still get nervous when they hear noises at night, and I can't look at a window without feeling a chill run down my spine. The lake house used to be our happy place, but now it's just a reminder of that summer. The summer we realized how vulnerable we really were. Sometimes I wonder if he's still out there, watching someone else's family, waiting for the right moment to make his move. I hope not, but I'll never know for sure that we sold the lake house a year later. It was a hard decision. We made so many memories there, but none of us could shake the feeling of being watched, even long after we'd left. The new owners never mentioned anything strange happening, and part of me hopes they never will. But I still think about that man sometimes, especially on quiet nights when the house creaks or the wind rustles the trees outside. I wonder if he ever thinks about us, if he remembers the fear he caused, or if we were just another family in a long line of obsessions. I'll never know, and maybe that's the scariest part. Not knowing why it happened or if it could happen again. To this day, I can't explain why he chose us or why he stopped coming around after that final night. It's like he just vanished, leaving behind nothing but questions and a lingering sense of dread. I try not to dwell on it too much, but every now and then I'll catch myself double-checking the locks or peeking through the curtains before bed. That summer changed something in me, something I can't quite put into words. It's not just the fear of him coming back. It's the realization that sometimes the things that scare us the most don't have answers. They just happen, and all we can do is try to move on, even if we're never really the same.